Thanks for taking time away from doom scrolling TikTok or reading Reddit or whatever it is you do at work during the day when you're supposed to be working. Um, we're going to have fun today talking about DMARC, how it all works, some of the technology behind it, what you actually do with it, and some of the things that can go wrong with it. Walk through all of this today. I'm Al Iverson, Industry Research and Community Lead for Valimail. I've been working here at Valimail for just about a year now, but my expertise and background goes back a bit further than that. I was Director of Deliverability for an email marketing platform for 15 years, and I've got a long history of helping folks deal with email deliverability, email authentication, and related issues. And then we've also got Ed Fisher from Microsoft. Ed, I hear that you drink coffee and know things.
That would be correct on both counts. How do you do, everybody? Again, my name is Ed Fisher. I'm Principal Product Manager for Microsoft Defender for Office 365. Happy to be here today.
Thank you, sir. So I represent Valimail. Valimail is a DMARC software as a service provider. We're a very specific point solution for DMARC, and I'll touch a little bit on what we can actually do there. We've got some as part of the explanation of how DMARC works, we'll talk about specifically what we bring to the table to do this. We've been in this space for a good long while, and we've helped a whole bunch of customers get to DMARC enforcement. So that's sort of our area of expertise. I don't want to dwell too long on the salesy stuff, but we're here if you need us. And of course, we like money, so please give us money. I won't dwell on this too long either, but here's some of the acronyms we're going to test through today. Throw it up there so that if you're looking at the recording or the slide deck later, you can freeze frame it and refresh your memory on some of those if they are confusing. And so I'm going to kick things off with an introduction about DMARC. What is the point of DMARC? What do you do with it? And when I talk about DMARC enforcement, of course, I'm going to have to let the dog in and out 50 times here during the webinar. Sorry about that. Kick him out of the room. The value of DMARC enforcement. When we talk about DMARC enforcement, we're talking specifically about publishing a DMARC policy, and that policy being something that tells mailbox providers, inbox providers, Microsoft, Gmail, Yahoo, other places that filter spam and handle mailboxes, tells them what to do with mail that fails authentication checks. And again, we'll walk through the steps of how that all works here in a second. But this is what you do with DMARC, is it helps you block phishing and spoofing by being able to say that, hey, I authenticate all my email, and if you get email that purports to be from my domain and it isn't actually from me, it fails authentication checks, you can tell those providers to throw it away or reject it or quarantine it. So what is DMARC at its core here? DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance, and it's an add-on, an adjunct to email authentication. It builds on two existing email authentication protocols called Sender Policy Framework and Domain Keys Identified Mail. We'll touch more on those in a second. And it also has this concept of alignment, and I'll show you an example of what alignment specifically means and how that looks. But in a nutshell, it's that the authentication identifier for a domain name, whether that be in the SPF domain, the return path domain of the message, or the DKIM signature that is associated with the hidden cryptographic signature calculated and stored in a hidden header in an email message. Alignment meaning that those match the visible from domain. And we'll touch a little bit on the history of it too. It's not a new protocol, proposed in 2012, right? So, and in fact, I looked on my spam resource blog, when was the first time I blogged about DMARC, and that was actually in 2012. PayPal and a whole bunch of other companies got together and were looking for ways to sort of put a lid on phishing and spoofing. And so that's where that got started. Now there's three core features of DMARC, things that, why does this thing exist and what do you do with it? That's authentication, policy enforcement, and reporting. And I'll touch on details of all of these, but authentication, right? You're saying you're able to tell the world that, hey, I authenticate all of the email that I send. Policy enforcement is, hey, you can tell the people that receive email what to do if mail purports to be from you but fails authentication checks, so you can use it to block spoofed emails, and reporting on all of that. So you get what's called DMARC reports, that are these feedback mechanisms from the mailbox providers that handle receiving inbound mail and spam filtering in a lot of cases, and it gives you feedback to show who out there in the world is spoofing your mail. Any use of that mail, legitimate or illegitimate, what do the mailbox providers see? And that's valuable to both make sure that you've got all of your mail identified, that you've configured everything that everybody in your company is sending to authenticate properly, and also to identify where the bad guys are, what they're doing, and see if and when they're actually actively trying to spoof your domain. So how do you do it? And I am going to be guilty here of grossly oversimplifying a very simple, or a very a process that can get pretty complex. So I'll try to simplify that down a little bit. And again, there's details of you can point records at us and use our automation to automatically update stuff. But in the specification, go look at the RFC for DMARC that defines all this stuff. It talks about a DNS record. You put a text record in DNS, or you put in text information that specifies a DMARC policy for that domain. So your process might be, you configure that DMARC record in DNS. You would typically set it up so that reporting will go to a tool or provider like Valimail, for example. You review that reporting, the point of which is to make sure that you're properly identifying all of your legitimate email sources. And that's one of the risks with DMARC is if you're going to turn on DMARC enforcement, you've got to first know that you're able to identify all of your legitimate mail services so that you know that they are all authenticated properly. There's this concept of shadow IT where maybe somebody in HR or some other department is using an outsourced service to handle new job applications, for example. And so if they've configured that service, it could be sending mail on behalf of your domain. If you in IT or security didn't know about it, you didn't work with them to configure email authentication, to configure DKIM or SPF or both for those, they could be sending out legitimate mail for your domain, but it's not passing authentication checks. And so if you enable DMARC protection to reject mail that fails authentication checks, you could accidentally block that legitimate mail, or cause that legitimate mail to be blocked because of that. So that's why it's important to identify all of the legitimate mail sources that are sending mail on behalf of your domain. And then when you're confident that you've got that bit right, that you are properly authenticating every piece of email you send, when you have that confidence to say that, hey, mailbox providers, hey, Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, everybody else, if somebody sends mail to you and it uses my domain, but it doesn't authenticate, don't let it go through. And that is the core goal of DMARC, to make it much harder for bad guys to spoof your email domain name. The technology of DMARC, and we'll go a little bit deeper here, right? And I think, I just talked about how the core of it helps you prevent phishing and spoofing. So people can't send mail to you or anybody else using your domain name. You control who can use your email domain name in email messages. It provides reporting. And again, as I touched on before, this reporting is valuable so that you have insight into what's going on, both for the good and for the bad, to make sure that you can identify legitimate email sources, whether you're sending email through, ESPs, the email service providers, marketing automation tools, think like, Salesforce Marketing Cloud, or MailChimp, or Braze, or the SMTP in the cloud services like SendGrid or Mailgun or Amazon SES. So this is how you get feedback to see how much mail is being sent from these different services using your domain name. It comes in handy too. It's a good sort of gut check to see, hey, so we are sending mail through Salesforce Marketing Cloud. Gmail says they're only seeing 100 messages, but the platform says we sent 100,000 messages. What's going on there? That sometimes the count information can be a little fuzzy, but it can come in handy to try to to understand if there's some sort of discrepancy between one bit of mail reporting and another. Take a sip of water here. We'll touch more on the authentication protocols on the next years, right? So they work hand in hand with email authentication. For DMARC to work properly, you've got to be able to authenticate the email that you send, and all of the outsourced providers that you might use to launch email messages, right? Either through an API, like we talked about SendGrid and Amazon SES, or going into UI and actually setting up campaigns, automations, whatever, in a marketing cloud platform or MailChimp or Aweber or what have you, newsletters, any of that sort of stuff, right? That's email authentication is key here, and that's what enables this ability to protect your domain name. So sender policy framework and domain keys identified mail, SPF and DKIM. These are the core email authentication protocols. This is this is how email authentication works today. It's based on these two protocols. SPF is simpler, a bit older. It is at its core effectively a list of IP addresses that are allowed to send mail for a domain. ESPs and CRMs often include, whether it be a CRM, customer relationship management platform, or an email service provider, marketing automation platform, they will often provide what is called an SPF include. They'll say, hey, when you create your text record for SPF, put this little bit of text that starts with include in your SPF record for your domain, so that you are telling the world that when I send email from my domain, that our platform, this outsourced platform that you might be using, is on the allow list of sending IP addresses for this domain name. There's some technical limits here with SPF, specifically 10 DNS lookups are allowed and no more for sender policy framework. And what can sort of cause more SPF lookups is additional things, additional platforms and service providers that you might put in your SPF record. If you use more than one or two different platforms, you're going to have multiple stuff in your SPF include, potentially. So that's SPF. And then there's domain keys identified mail, or DKIM. DKIM, like I said before, it creates a cryptographic signature. And the signature is in a hidden email header. So you can view source or show original in your email platform, and you'll see a header that says DKIM signature, and it'll have some information about which domain it relates to and the actual sort of calculation of that signature. And on receiving a message inbound, the mailbox provider that receives mail and drops it into your inbox, they can read that header and they check it against what's called a public key in DNS. So this is what's called public-private key cryptography, if you're not familiar with that. And what it does is it lets somebody sign a message generating that signature when they send it, and then the mailbox provider checks that signature to calculate if it is correct. And what it is affirming when it is correct is that the bits in the email message covered by the signature, typically the body, typically lots of the different headers, it's configurable. So that's again, there's a little asterisk of bit of simplification, but it's confirming that stuff covered by the signature has not changed since the message was generated. So basically it's saying, hey, if I send an email as me, Al Iverson, with aliverson.com, and that email message has a DKIM signature that says signed by aliverson.com, that's telling the world that aliverson.com initiated that message, and that the content or the bits covered by the signature have not changed since that message was initiated. And that's sort of the point of DKIM. One of the points of DKIM there is to identify if something has changed in the message, where a bad guy might pick up an email and try to change it and resend it to other people to spoof or phish them. So that's how DKIM does that. It's all based on private and public keys in DNS. Inbound mailbox providers being able to check that key to see what the sender or sending platform has signed upon creating the message. And that's how they tell that this message is created by an entity actually connected with the responsible for that domain. And I am sure there is somebody out there who works with MOG or the IETF who will have some technical problem with my explanation there, because there's lots of little fiddly bits around the edges around how this all works in different edge cases. And it's kind of fun actually to be a part of some of these groups and sort of work through, watch them and learn how the sausage is being made, to see as we work through some of the edge cases, technical limitations, or what might go into a future state of DKIM, for example. And so DMARC adds on top of that by looking for that, to have a successful DMARC pass, you're looking for authenticated SPF or DKIM, and that aligns, meaning matches the from address in one or both of those. So that if that's how you get a DMARC pass, is that it has one or both of those authentication settings, and that they match, they align with the visible from domain in the message. More on alignment here. And so there's different headers, right? There's you could say, depending on how you define what a from address is, there are multiple from addresses in the header. The SMTP envelope or return path header, sometimes also called an M from. I used to call it the bounce domain back at my marketing cloud days, working for an email service provider where we primarily used it to track bounces. That's a header that is a from address that is actually transmitted in the mail transaction, the SMTP server transaction, when the message is transmitted from a sending server to a receiving server. Or maybe there's some steps in there in between, but that's the point of that, is that's the return path that is transmitted in the SMTP conversation. So that's one place where there's a responsible identity for a message, right? And so that's a from address and a domain that shows up in that one place, but that's not the same as the visible from address. They don't technically have to match. They're two totally separate things. And then you have a third point of domain matching there too, and that's that hidden DKIM signature header. And so you've got those three different places there, right? And they could be three separate domains. And this was a problem going back for years in email. I've been probably sent my first, double opt-in sign-up email for my friend's jazz club in 1998 or 1999. And that was a problem back then. There was no good way to authenticate that. If my little Minnesota Jazz server was sending invites for signups for the Jazz Club's newsletter, there was no good way to say, hey, this message was from a server allowed to send mail on behalf of this. There are some hacky ways to do it. A lot of it was based on block lists and trying to block bad guys doing silly stuff, but there wasn't really a good way to sort of stand up and stamp the mail as proved, authenticated, that this is really from who it says it's from. And so here's how we do that, is we look for alignment under DMARC. And that's how you can say that the visible from address, the actual from address that a person who receives the message, when they see the message, that's how you get some sort of level of confidence that it's legitimate. If DMARC passed, there's an assumption that one or both of these identifiers aligned or matched. And so you can say that there was an authentication check that aligns with the visible from domain, and the message really came from the entity whose domain shows in that visible from address. That's sort of the whole key here of the enterprise. We will authenticate email messages and then align to say that authentication matches the visible from domain. Now, there's some legitimate reasons where these headers might not all align. So keep in mind that there can be cases where lack of alignment doesn't mean failure. This is sort of a common confusion point with DMARC. A client just came to me last week, made a little video about it. So they use a certain email platform for their one-to-one corporate emails. They added a second domain, and that second domain does not allow for SPF alignment. And they thought that was a failure case, even though there's DKIM still in place, even though it's still passing DMARC because of that DKIM thing. Another case there is email marketing platforms, newsletter platforms. I think of Ghost or Substack or Beehive, Aweber, MailChimp, whatever. They might set a different return path domain so that they can track bounces better. Back in the day, bounce tracking was a huge, complicated mess. And so some smart people came up with, actually one guy came up with this, I think. There's variable envelope return path, or VERP. And so it used encoded strings in the return path, and anything when it came back to that encoded string was assumed to be a bounce for that original recipient. And some platforms still use that today. It's still very important. I remember seeing this VERP on listserv in the 1990s. This thing is VERP might be older than DIRT, but it is very valuable for tracking bounces, and that's a legitimate use case where you might see the return path, username part, domain part, probably both, because the ESP wants the bounces to come back to them and get tracked, not match your visible from domain. So keep in mind that DMARC says as long as one or the other, SPF or DKIM, align or match, you're good. Hey, in a perfect world, it's great to have all three identifiers perfectly match all the time. Set up a bunch of clients this way when they set up custom domains in Marketing Cloud, and so that's great if you can do it. But it's a belt and suspenders methodology, and not all platforms can support it, and that's okay. That is the longest story I've ever told about DMARC alignment. Let's talk more about the technology. There's a whole bunch of stuff here that I could go way deep into. I don't know that I'll go super deep into them with other than to just touch on them that they exist. RUA and RUF are types of reporting. RUA is your reporting for aggregate reporting, and that's what we think of as typical DMARC reporting. You get XML files. I'll show you an example here in a second. Back from these different providers. They feed into a platform or a tool if you want to have something automatically parse it for you. You might generate graphs or maps. I'll show you an example of that here in a second. That's just your aggregate level counts of pass fails, domains, sources, and so forth. It tends not to contain stuff that you might consider PII. It's not going to contain bodies, subject lines, that sort of thing. That's what RUF reporting does, called failure or forensic reporting. That's another thing where there's at least one guy on Reddit who's very angry when I call it forensic reporting instead of failure reporting, but that's sort of a common term there. This is the more detailed example of failed messages. It is handy when you're troubleshooting really weird stuff going wrong, but it can also be a privacy nightmare, and a lot of mailbox providers don't send it because of that, because it contains full messages, full bodies, full headers, the whole thing. So anything that was in the message originally would be in an RUF report, and that is enough of a privacy nightmare that, because, for example, for concerns over GDPR, a lot of European providers don't send those. So you don't see a lot of those. So even if you set up, if you want to explore DMARC and learn from it and sort of play around and see, you can set up these RUA and RUF tags to come to you and just drop it in your mailbox. I do it with my domain. They're not huge. It's not something you want to capture it for a million domains and save them forever. But even when you set that up for example, RUF for failure reporting, it's extremely rare to get one of those in my experience. Other bits, we'll talk more about this with Ed too, the percent tag, and why that just does not work the way you might hope it does. And then there's ASPF and ADKIM, and that's the A there means alignment, and this is where you can set relaxed or strict alignment. Relaxed meaning the from domain or subdomain or fully qualified domain name or host name has to exactly match down to the letter what's in the other identifier, whether it be the SPF domain or the DKIM domain, versus relaxed alignment, which means they both have to be part of the same organizational domain. What that means is, like if you have email.spamresource.com and spamresource.com, those are both part of spamresource.com. Spamresource.com is the organizational level, what I think of as the upper level, the topmost level for that domain. So relaxed alignment allows these identifiers for authentication to match just based on that. In my experience, it's more common to see DKIM match exactly, and SPF from different platforms that are doing bulk sending tend to match under relaxed alignment because they might set up custom host names to do bounce tracking for automations and that sort of thing. And as I mentioned before, DMARC is not new. I've been blogging about it, boy, almost since the beginning. And a lot of providers have supported it for a long time. I remember the heady days of watching what mailbox providers were doing when they first started to implement P equals reject for different webmail for domains, and when mailbox providers started respecting DMARC policy and rejecting mail when it was failing those checks. That was a significant change. It changed how mailing lists work. It changed how email forwarding works. And occasionally you get somebody very mad about that too. Well, there's different ways to deal with that, like ARC. authenticated received chain, I think, is the acronym there, and we'll touch more on that in a second. That's an example of how you can sort of encode and save authentication results for forwarding. Gets pretty complex, but it comes in handy. There's just a few specific use cases, and I remember blogging about this when I saw Microsoft using ARC, that this is a fantastic use case for it that actually helps cover email forwarding in a way that that solves some of the problems out there. There's people trying to solve that other ways too, and not everybody supports ARC, but the people that do, there's some value there to it, I think. So DMARC reporting, you can see along the side here of the slide, here's a little bit of an XML report, right? So these XML reports are what I call DMARC reports, what the spec probably calls aggregate reporting. And this is, again, this is just summary information and counts. It doesn't contain full raw messages. What it does contain is it says who's reporting this data back to you. In this case, it's coming from Microsoft, says org name Outlook. It's a DMARC report. There's a date range. It says what domain, XNND is one of my domains. Shows what passed and failed based on what, as far as what policy I'm publishing for that domain. And then you've got some identifiers there to show, hey, somebody's trying to send mail from this server, this IP address to people at Hotmail, at Outlook, and what are the failures from some of that, and both successes and failures for that. So that's the core of it, and it's sort of human readable, right? If you look at it, you can say, okay, there's mail that was sent from my server XNND with DKIM with the selector of X. And the result was that message passed authentication checks properly. If this was reflecting phishing and spoofing, you'd see fails in there. Or if something went wrong technically, like if a forwarding step changed a header that it shouldn't have, the signature might not verify anymore, and it might show a fail condition. Now, like I said, this is almost human readable, and that's where if you're not going to try to manually parse XML files, a tool or service like Valimail comes in very handy there. And not only do we take these reports and we automatically feed them into a reporting dashboard and map and breakdowns for you, we also proactively identify the different sending sources. So you look at this XML file, there's an IP address of a server and they're sending mail. If that was SendGrid or SES, when it was fed into Valimail to build reporting for you, it's actually going to say SendGrid or Amazon SES. That's how we identify a sending service, right? Where we will, instead of just showing a raw IP address, we have internal mapping that we track and have automation to correct and add on to that shows you that it's, for example, Microsoft 365 and not just IP address 1234. So as I said, DMARC is a text record in DNS. There's a couple other ways to do it, right? Some people have you set up a CNAME, or you might point at an NS record in your DNS settings so that you can have us populate that actual sort of text record for you. And these records are all public, and that's kind of neat. It's kind of fun. You can do research on the broader email industry. You can do research on your competitors in a given space, in a given industry. You can go to one of any number of DMARC record lookup tools, including the Valimail domain checker, and plug in a domain name like I've done here in this screenshot with Microsoft. You can look up Microsoft's DMARC record. So this is what they publish. They've got a policy of P equals reject for all of their mail. And they have two specific addresses there that they are asking mailbox providers to send reports to. One address for aggregate reporting, those XML files we talked about, and one other address for failure reports or forensic reports for troubleshooting. Pause here while I take a sip. So DMARC has policy settings as part of that record there, right? You saw there's P equals reject. That means that Microsoft's policy is reject. And so there's three levels of policy there. There's none, quarantine, or reject. None means do nothing. You might enable that just to gather reporting. There's a lot of people out there that publish P equals none and don't do anything else, which is unfortunate, which means you have no insight into who's spoofing your domain. much better to set up at least a RUA tag or work with a provider or platform like us so that you can see who's out there sending mail from your domain name. Now, when you move up from none, the next level up there is quarantine. And that's just as it sounds. You're saying, hey, please quarantine these messages. How people implement that on the receiving end might vary a little bit. Then you have reject, which by default, reject is, of course, asking mailbox providers, inbox providers, people who are receiving inbound email messages to reject messages that fail authentication checks and don't align, don't have that past authenticating alignment with the visible from domain. There's some inbox providers and even secure email gateways might have settings to override that in some instances or make exceptions either for policy overall or for just certain senders. But at the end of the day, the domain owner is by publishing reject, they're asking for people on the inbound side to reject that mail if it's not authenticating properly. And word of that, it touched on, a lot of people publish equals none and done nothing else. A lot of that comes out of Yahoo and Google sender requirements that came up. Is first announced in October 2023, where ESP platforms, bulk senders, people sending newsletters, marketing mail, that sort of thing, Yahoo and Google published that as a requirement. And because the bare minimum of that requirement was P equals none, that's what a lot of people did. So it doesn't actually protect it. But here is how you protect your domain with DMARC. Now, I want to make it clear that we're not saying that we are a substitute for what a secure email gateway, for what Ed and Microsoft and MDO do. We're not a substitute for that. We're a tiny little piece of this puzzle as published by a domain owner, right? And so you've got all these different services out here, good services, bad services, could be, legitimate stuff, but there's also weird, bad stuff going on too. So that hits the door, the inbound mailbox provider's front door. So the mailbox provider is going to do all these different checks to identify if they think the mail is good or bad, right? It could be IP reputation, domain reputation. Are they on block lists? Header and technical settings. Are they complying with sender requirements, right? Does it have one-click unsubscribe? Even that in some instances, Gmail saying that's a must for bulk mail now. So there's all this different stuff. Fingerprinted content, keyword searches, all of this stuff of history and reputation that go into whether or not mail gets accepted, and then whether it goes to the inbox or whether it goes to the spam folder. Now, that's my background to some degree is email deliverability, right? It's helping email senders be able to send wanted mail to people who want it and get it to the inbox. But now specifically here with DMARC, there's a little bit of a different remit, right? There's what happens here is one of these sets of checks here are for email authentication, and people who use Valimail can set up our automation so that we handle authentication checks. You can manage DKIM keys with us. We have SPF automation to work around the limits of SPF, the 10 lookup limit that I touched on before. Then we also have we help clients publish their DMARC policy setting so that we set them up so that we can tell Microsoft, in this case, to reject mail if it fails authentication checks. And we also capture the inbound reporting, and we build dashboards and maps of where mail is coming from. We identify the different services behind that mail. We help them automate and upgrade their policy to enforcement over time. And then we add on other stuff too, like cool little Vimy logos for marketing senders to help boost engagement. But the key here is for us to help apply as sort of a zero trust check for email authentication. That when our clients are best configured, the goal there is to not let stuff through unless it passes authentication checks. Don't assume, don't bypass. If it doesn't have the key, you don't let it through the door. Pardon me. All right, so last little bit here is sort of visualizing what I just said about some of the stuff that Valimail does to help our clients. We've got our free monitor platform where you can sign up today and build reporting just like this automatically. You set up your DMARC record, you publish that out, and then we capture those reports. And as soon as they start to come in, might take a day or two, depending on how often different platforms report it. depending on how often you send mail, how much mail you send. There's got to be activity to be able to report on activity. And we pull it together and we show what's passing, what's failing, where it's coming from, both geographically and the different platforms that are in use. So I touched on just briefly these Yahoo and Google. Poor Ed, he's probably tired of me saying Yahoo and Google over and over. Give me a hard time about it when you need to. But Yahoo and Google, you look at this boost here. This boost in DMARC policies is because of Yahoo and Google. They starting right about here, they published updates that said, "Hey, come the early part of 2024, we are going to require bulk senders to have to authenticate mail with SPF and DKIM and also publish a DMARC record." And so that really drove this boost in DMARC adoption, where it just went crazy there. You can see there's slow growth, slow growth, slow growth, giant boost, and now we're back to a little bit slower growth. Still faster than it was before. People are getting smarter about it. There are a lot of domains out there that are protected with DMARC, but there's still a lot to do there too, because there's a lot of people that either don't know what DMARC is or why they need it, or they might even think, I don't send mail with my domain. Why do I need DMARC to protect it or report on it? But everybody gets spoofed at some point, and that's why DMARC is kind of an important thing to protect domain and report on what's actually going on, who's trying to send email with your domain. And there's a whole bunch of stuff out there in the news too, going back a ways. Not even thinking of the broader, the $1 trillion of business email compromise, not that stuff, but more specifically with DMARC, with, like, for example, it was reported on May or June 2024 that North Korea was actively looking for domains that don't have good DMARC policies so that they could spoof them. And North Korea's goal was to gather intelligence, right? So they were reaching out to people involved in that sphere of world, trying to identify intelligence, reaching out to people who might be doing research or collecting their own intel on North Korea, and pretending to be coworkers, colleagues, vendors, whatever, to try to slide into the inbox and get them to give up information. Now, as my wife runs a bookstore, and I don't think North Korea cares about my wife's bookstore, but so I don't think that North Korea is going to try to spoof her domain. But what I do think is that what one bad guy does, others watch and want to learn from. And so that's perfect example of people searching for unprotected domains or poorly protected domains. They see other people doing it, and they're going to go, "Oh, I can do this too." And so that's probably leading to more people doing phishing and spoofing of other domains as well. Now, I think this is a good segue to talk about where it can all go wrong. What do you think, Ed? Should we talk about DMARC adoption challenges?
I would love that. I'm going to ask you to kick off. I'm answering a question in the chat, and then I will happily pile on.
All right, so I'll do a little song and dance here. And I've talked about this on my blog, and I think I'm going to do a video on it here shortly too. There's people get stuff wrong in DMARC records, and so it's tough. And make sure when you set up a DMARC record that you validate that it's set up correctly. For example, I could think of probably 5 other examples that aren't even on here, but getting the policy word wrong. Like, I admit I'm even guilty of this. I did P equals policy once when setting up a domain. When you're typing stuff out manually, you're copying and pasting it for 50 different domains. Maybe you're not yet using a solution like us that has automation to deal with that for you. But the domain policy is only none, quarantine, or reject. There is no P equals policy. There is no localized non-English version of reject or quarantine. People do that all the time. People sometimes set their reporting domain to example.com, which is, of course, is not a real domain for purposes of accepting DMARC reporting. So don't just blindly copy and paste. Make sure you are paying close attention and make sure you test it when you set it up.
Yes, and the records are case sensitive. So if you're implementing a DMARC record, please use some validation, whether it's something at MX Toolbox or other website, to make sure that you don't have typos and also that your cases are correct. P equals none. So again, I'm from Microsoft, largest enterprise mailbox provider in the world, one of the largest consumer mailbox providers in the world. We see stuff all the time. A lot of enterprise escalations come across my desk, and some of the stuff here is stuff that I encounter almost every day. Some of the stuff, thankfully not every day, but often enough, wanted to include it here. So yes, P equals none. Okay, you've got a DMARC policy. Something fails SPF, something fails DKIM. What am I supposed to do as a mailbox provider? Well, P equals none says deliver it anyway. Kind of missing the point there. Okay, you know who's supposed to be sending your email. You're trying to make sure that your email is authenticating, but if it doesn't, P equals none. You want me to deliver it anyway. Now, that doesn't mean some deeper in the stack protection won't identify content or reputation or malicious content, but really authentication is table stakes. Again, we're talking stuff that's 10 plus years old. P equals none is not only missing the boat, you're going to have some further compliance issues in the very near future. Setting a percent of less than 100. Now, if you have no PCT value at all, that's the same thing as 100. If you have any PCT value other than 100, what it means is that for whatever percent that is, the DMARC policy action will take effect. For everything else, it'll be the next step down. So if you were trying to test deployment, I would not do it this way, but I've seen customers do it this way, where they will set a PCT of 5 and a P equals quarantine. And what that means is that 5% of the messages that fail will be quarantined and 95% of them will be none. They'll be delivered. Just as if you did 5% to reject, then the next 95% might be quarantined. Really, if you're in the point where you're testing, do a P equals none because you're not confident, but then make sure you're doing RUA at the minimum, RUF possibly, and paying attention to those to identify those things that are sending messages as if they were you when they're not. Using third-party providers, whether they are bulk email providers, CRM systems, outsourced human resources providers, anything that's you're using that's supposed to be sending email as you're not including them in your SPF records, you're not expecting them to do DKIM signing. We see tons of what we refer to as IO spoof, an organizational spoof, where your company is Contoso.com, a message comes from the outside world that says it's from Contoso.com, but it's not. Is it legit? It's your outsourced HR provider? Is it not legit? It's somebody trying to fool your users. So make sure your third-party providers are DKIM signing, and also that you're either including them in your SPF or putting include statements to use their SPF record, because while your currents are of course going to be able to look at DKIM or SPF or both, some legacy systems are still only able to do SPF. So you do want to make sure that these providers are in your SPF to ensure maximum likelihood legit mail gets delivered and illegitimate mail does not. Not including or using subdomains. So if you have a commercial domain, Contoso.com, and your regular users send and receive email, user@contoso.com, consider using subdomains for purpose-specific uses like CRM or marketing mail, volume mail. So, user@marketing.contoso.com or sales information at sales.contoso.com, so that as you are doing things and these different subsidiaries or different organizational units may want to do separate things or contract with other providers, you're separating that out from your main commercial or corporate identity. There's also the fear of breaking stuff. Every week, sometimes multiple times in a week, I'm dealing with somebody who has an SPF that's on soft fail, doesn't have a DMARC policy, can't even spell DKIM, doesn't want to make any changes because they're afraid of breaking stuff. At the end of the day, if you have to break stuff to get to enforcement, then it's worth breaking. Whether it's shadow IT or legacy processes that you don't know, you don't understand, getting to at least the point where you have an RUA and are looking at the reports that come in to identify the things that are sending as if your domain. If P equals none, deliverer is still there. But now you're starting to wrap your arms around who's sending emails if it's your domain so that you can move to that point. Seen lots of times where the RUF and the RUA addresses are invalid. I'll use an example where I've literally seen somebody who had example.com because they just copied and pasted from some website and gave it no thought at all. Or they put in an email address that NDRs because it's not there anymore, or it goes to a shared mailbox that's being ignored, or it goes to an employee who left your company 5 years ago and every RU report that goes in there bounces and nobody pays any attention. Only slightly worse than having them go to a mailbox that's being ignored. It's good to look at those reports. And quite frankly, if you're not going to look at those reports, you should be using Valimail. If you are a Microsoft 365 customer, then Valimail will provide RUA for you at no cost because we Microsoft partnered with them to do that. Please look at doing that. It is so much better than just ignoring this situation. Another problem, Al mentioned ARC. Unfortunately, while ARC is a standard, not all security providers support it. When you have belt and braces or layered defenses or multiple providers, if a mail goes to the first provider, it's DKIM signed, the first provider validates the signature and then changes the message before it goes to the next provider, that invalidates DKIM signature. ARC maintains chain of custody and says, okay, first provider validated the DKIM signature, second provider can be configured to trust that the first provider did that. But if your first provider doesn't support ARC and they make a change to the message which invalidates the DKIM signature, the second provider has no choice but to say, well, the DKIM signature doesn't validate. Something was modified. So either the second provider is going to false positive and quarantine and reject everything that fails DKIM, or has to be configured to ignore that. And neither of those situations are good. If you are using multiple providers and your upstream provider doesn't support ARC, you need to pressure them to support ARC. If they do, implement it, use it. If they don't and you don't want to make a change, then look at moving anything that modifies a message downstream to the second provider. Putting external in the subject line, rewriting links, inserting that little disclaimer in the colored box at the top of the body that says, think before you click, this message came from outside. All of those things will invalidate the DKIM signature. All of those things can be done by the downstream security provider, and that allows DKIM to be maintained from the sending system all the way to the mailbox provider. And that's really important. And then finally, conflating authentication and anti-phishing. A properly formatted message coming from a proper MTA where it's being DKIM signed and you've got your DMARC set to P equals reject and everything is great, does not mean the message is legitimate. If I compromise a Gmail account and I start sending phishing messages from al@gmail.com, those messages, they're going to pass the SPF. They're going to pass the DKIM. There's a DMARC policy that's going to be P equals reject, but hey, they pass. So they're going to go through. What you're doing here is not a bulletproof, cover everything, no phishing's ever going to get through, no malware is ever going to get through. What you're doing is you're stopping the fraudulent, the spoofing, the impersonation, which is a very, very important part of the entire process, but far from being the only part of the process. So don't say, we've got DMARC in place and everybody who sends us emails got DMARC in place because everybody's good and that's going to stop all the badness. No, but it's a very critical and important first step of many. Out, back to you.
Yeah, and especially that last point because some, I've had people sort of argue, well, DMARC failed us and that somebody still got a bad message. And like you said, if somebody hacks into an account and sends email from that account is mail from that account is going to pass authentication checks. And you think of it as you lock the door, but somebody broke in the window. It doesn't mean the door lock was useless. You still need to lock the door, but you also need to lock the window, right? You need to protect accounts. Stuff like multi-factor authentication and everything else you need in play to keep the workplace network and everybody's account safe and secure. DMARC is part of that solution, but it is not the only piece of it. So finally here, and we're in the home stretch. Thank you everybody for hanging in there. Appreciate you. Just a quick note on future email requirements. Looking into my crystal ball here, and with the healthy dollop of making stuff up, um, PCI compliance, for example, the 4.0 spec does refer to DMARC. It also has specific requirements around protecting employees against phishing and spoofing. And PCI compliance is very important. PCI means payment card industry, and there's a DSS, a security spec specific to that. And so you can learn more about that. Our COO, Kevin Dunn, and I put together a little 10-minute video. It's almost a little mini webinar explaining what we know about PCI compliance and why you might want to use DMARC as part of your compliance solution there. Again, just like Ed and I talked about, it doesn't check all the boxes, but it checks a very specific box. There's a useful purpose there. So if you're going to look that up, there's a link to that with my link shortener. U.S. government has recommended it over the years as well, going back, I think, to 2017 or 2018. DHS, NIST, and others specifically point out that DMARC is very useful, very helpful to protect against phishing and spoofing. So it's another sort of don't take our word for it. This is other people saying that DMARC is a good thing to implement properly. Mailbox provider requirements, talking about Yahoo and Google, right? They announced this in October 2023. And here's where I get to the making stuff up part, right? Do I know for sure that Yahoo and Google are going to say you have to move to P equals reject? No, they haven't specifically said that. But when I think about where stuff is going, where we're heading for email security and email protection, it seems very reasonable, very likely, in my opinion, that we're heading in that direction, Matt. At some point, mailbox providers, people hosting mailboxes, are going to want that extra level of protection visible in the DMARC record to say that there's an actual policy that says to quarantine or reject email messages. So Ed and I were joking about this before in the prep session, where is it necessarily a future-proof configuration? But is it a smart configuration? Yeah, probably. MOG is a mouthful. M3AAWG, the Messaging Mobile Malware Anti-Abuse Working Group. I'll give you $1 if you can say that 10 times fast. They've been around for just over 10 years now. I think that was 2004, 2005. I remember the deliverability audit that preceded it in 2003, and I think that was sort of the kickoff for the stuff that led to MOG. What they are is they are an email industry collaborative group made up of people who care about keeping this email ecosystem usable. That was the core, the starting thing there for MOG, was to keep email from being overrun with bad stuff. They've expanded that a little bit too, right? They also include mobile and malware now. But the goal here is to keep these communication ecosystems available to all and workable for all. And so they publish information on best practices, and that includes DMARC. They also meet and collaboratively work together to figure stuff out and improve things. And I'm, one of the subgroups that I'm helping out on is really to help drive further adoption of DMARC through, obviously benefits us, but it also benefits the email ecosystem, benefits you as an email user too, right? Because if your email inbox is overrun with garbage, phishing, spoofing, spam, whatever, it's unusable. So my little part of helping to drive adoption of one of the little bits that help do that through MOG. That's very important. You want to learn more about that too, there's a link to MOG's white paper on DMARC specifically. And that brings us to the end. I think we've got time for some questions here. Ed has been doing a fantastic job answering a lot of these in the chat. I appreciate you, sir.
I will give you just a second to see what I haven't gotten to yet.
All right.
Let's see. So open questions I haven't gotten to yet. Will it eventually be a de facto requirement to have both SPF and DKIM alignment with DMARC in order to reach addresses of major B2C mailbox providers? Alex, that's an either or. Speaking on behalf of one of these mailbox providers, again, we're the largest commercial provider, one of the largest consumer providers. The idea is that either the sender's in the SPF record or the DKIM signature validates. It does not have to be both, and in many cases, it won't be both. SPF has a 10 DNS lookup limit. There are a lot of customers who have so many things sending on their behalf that they can't get into that 10 maximum queries. Also, of those 10 responses, if there's so many characters in the response that it has to go from UDP to TCP, in other words, more than 512 characters, they might not get an answer anyway. There are providers, including Valimail, that can do a hosted SPF, but not all systems quite use that yet. And even so, when you're using third-party providers, having to keep up with their records if they don't give you an include makes that challenging. So DKIM signing says if you are signing with the private key that associates with the public key that I publish in DNS, and that signature validates, I don't care where the message came from, you have access to the private key, you are considered a legitimate sender, and authentication works okay there. And Sylvia just pointed out Valimail out, missing an I. We missed that in our QC of the slides.
Sorry, folks. I always put in a typo. That way I'm checking to see if people are paying attention here. I'll put my
Sylvia wins the prize.
Yeah. And your point about alignment, actually, so people confuse lack of alignment with failure all the time. That is such a common thing there, especially like if you in some platforms, if you add additional domains, you only get alignment, SPF alignment, for example, for the first domain. Or like Aweber, for example, is a really popular email marketing and newsletter platform. And they, like a lot of other platforms, they don't let you customize the SPF. So you're never going to have SPF alignment. Your return path domain is never going to match. That's okay. As long as DKIM is configured properly and set up, in a perfect world, yeah, you know, when I worked for an enterprise marketing platform where we set up custom domains under a subdomain for a client, there would be like 12 DNS entries for that subdomain. We'd help them customize all of that. It's always their domain name. In that instance, yeah, those customers on that platform, they can have full alignment with both SPF and DKIM, and that's great. It's like Ed said, it's belt and braces. It's a good secondary cover if, for example, forwarding mangles the DKIM signature or mangles an SPF result because it passed through another server. But not every platform supports that, and that's okay.
There is a question from Daisy on how to set up with Valimail for DMARC reporting.
So it's pretty easy. And I think somebody in here too asked about their forwarding mail through some other appliance there too as well. And will Valimail report on that? And the answer is yes. You go into Valimail. If you want to set up DMARC reporting, you can do that for free with Valimail Monitor. You go to our website, you click on create your free monitor account. It's not a demo. It's a specific platform that you will continue to have free access to. We'll guide you through the steps of how to link up to your domain provider or DNS provider if you want to use our automation steps to implement the DNS record, or if you want to copy and paste it yourself, we'll guide you on that too. And configure that and then come back tomorrow and look. The reason, we'll get you up and running pretty quickly. We'll give you the stuff, you'll put it in DNS. Most of the mailbox providers that send these DMARC feedback reports do so daily. So you're not going to, it takes a little bit of time there before you start to see reports, but you do that and then it'll start to populate. And then you can start to see exactly what sending sources are in use and who out there is sending mail that either is legitimately on your behalf or pretending to be you.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for the reminder. Al, when are the slides of the recording going to be available and how can people get to them?
We will send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording, and I will try to include the slides in there as well. We'll also change over the registration page into an archive page with the recorded webinar too. So keep an eye out for that. We'll follow up with that. And if we're taking too long or you got questions, feel free to drop me an email at my correct email address, al.iverson@valimail.com.
Okay, Anani had a specific question about Exchange Online. Rather than reading it, I'll just reply directly. Extended message trace can be exported. You can copy and paste that and send it to the sending system. But of course, that requires that they have some legitimate address in that email for you to get to it. If it's bouncing because they didn't put a legitimate email address in there, who is your friend to try to find at least the administrative contact? But that is rarely going to be the email system contact. So your mileage may vary on that one. yes, extended message trace can be exported, copied and pasted, sent wherever you want it to go.
All right. Thanks, Ed. We're over time, so I think this is probably a good time, good place to wrap it up. If you have any burning questions that we didn't get to, again, you can still drop me an address and get a bonus point if you correct my typo. And thank you so much for spending time with us today. Appreciate you. Thank you, Ed. I really appreciate your help with this. This is a lot of fun. Everybody, have a great rest of your day.
All right. Bye, everybody.